Okay. And also just want to make a note that we will be recording this session. I believe you'll probably get a notification that we're recording. So we're going to have that available afterwards. Let me know if you have any questions about that. But we are recording as of now. And still lots of people coming in. Good morning, everyone. Welcome all the newcomers. All right. Okay, and forgive me for repeating myself, but just for the people who are just joining us, I see almost everyone has your microphone muted. That's fantastic. We're going to ask you to keep that muted during the presentation. Afterwards, we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, but if you can keep your microphone off for now, that will help us limit background noise, feedback loops, that kind of thing. And then if you do want to have your video on, though, we invite that. We're so happy to see your smiling faces this morning. Thank you for joining us. And I think we are slowing down in terms of people coming in. So let me pivot just a little bit. In addition to welcoming you to today's session, I wanted to, especially for those who are new to the Mission Forward workshop series, really welcome you and tell you a little bit about not only today's session, but this program in general. So this is the first installment in 2021 of our Mission Forward workshop series. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a way for charitable ventures to engage with the community and with our colleagues and with the sector to try to collectively tackle some of the most pressing issues that we're all facing. So today we have a really special program with a guest speaker who's going to be fantastic and talk to us in honor of Women's History Month. I almost said Women's Health, Women's History Month. But we're also going to have this year several more rich discussions on relevant topics that we really want you to stay tuned for and join us. So we'll be hosting Mission Forward workshops quarterly. Our fantastic new marketing manager, Annie wave at us, will be making sure that you don't miss a thing. You'll be getting emails and notifications so you'll know when to sign up. But thank you so much. Like many of you, we kind of had to pivot some of our programming this year and move the whole thing virtual. We hope to get back into a room with all of you at some time again. But today especially, it's so wonderful to have people joining us from all over, not just from Orange County and Southern California. So we're really grateful for this virtual opportunity. And we really thank you for being here. So keep your eyes peeled for more Mission Forward workshop series installments. And thank you again for being here. So I also want to say we are going to monitor the chat while our guest speaker, Kimmy Carlos, is speaking. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll gather them up and make sure that we have an opportunity to add them to the discussion at the end. Also at the end, Kimmy will let us know when you can unmute your microphones and ask questions if you have them. So just know that we will have an opportunity to really turn this into a discussion. And if you have anything you want to put in the chat, I'll keep an eye out for it. And finally, I would like to introduce Amy Klein, who is the Director of Programs and who is the one who knows Kimmy Carlos and brought her in for this wonderful engagement for us. So Amy, if you would like to take it away, please.
I will briefly take it away from you. And I just wanted to let everyone know that wonderful introduction was from Dana Adams, our program manager here at Charitable Ventures. So thank you, Dana, and thank you everyone for joining us and bringing your tea and your coffee and bagels and breakfast with us this morning. For those of you who might be new to our work, as Dana mentioned, we do have people from, I think, all over with us today. visit our website, take a look there. And I know Annie, our marketing manager, will be super happy if I plug our social media. So we are on Twitter, we're on Facebook and LinkedIn. So follow us. We're happy to follow you back and share out to the world what you're doing. But on our website, you will see that we work with all of our stakeholders, which are many of you in the room, to address critical social issues happening here in Orange County. We do that by supporting collaborative regional efforts. We've worked deeply in the census and doing a lot of COVID relief work, to incubating new ideas as a fiscal sponsor. We currently have 36 amazing projects on our platform, to providing practical and innovative consulting to nonprofits and foundations, providing services such as evaluation and grant writing and strategic support. But as you all now know, because you're here in this room today, we offer workshops as a key support to all of you to help you expand your work, expand your partnerships, and be an active part of things that are happening here. So obviously this is Women's History Month, and it's an important time to reflect on women's issues and women's causes. And as I was starting to think about this particular event and how I wanted to frame that and what I wanted it to look like and who I might know, immediately I did think about my friend and colleague, Kimmy Carlos, who you'll see was an obvious choice for this workshop. And I just wanted to share with you that I met Kimmy, I didn't look up the date, but it was about 10 years ago when I was the executive director of a nonprofit in New Jersey. And my son, who was then in middle school, came home and told me he needed to write a report on a civil rights activist, and he chose Olympian John Carlos. So ironically, I had heard about Kimmy, but at that point we hadn't crossed paths. So I just happened to see that she was giving a talk at a local YWCA. So I immediately signed us up to go to the event, which happened to be during the day. So I did shamefully the mom thing and pulled my kids out of school and lied and said that they were sick. And then of course that backfired because the principal was at the talk. So he was very gracious. I sort of waved and he shrugged his shoulders and he was like, it's okay, it's okay. But I was so grateful that my kids had that opportunity to hear Kimmy's story that day, to ask important questions and to start thinking about social justice. I was also grateful, frankly, that at the end, Kimmy let me take pictures of her with my children. And I basically turned her like the Disneyland experience where you grab Mickey Mouse and you take your picture with Mickey Mouse. It was like that, Kimmy. I'm really sorry, but but I do have those pictures, and it was an important day for the kids and for me. So I might have originally met Kimmy due to her history and her relationship with her father, but I have stayed connected with her because of who she is as a person. And I'm really, really just grateful to know her and have this relationship with her, and to have had the experience of seeing her and watching her grow even more in the last decade. So I know you'll enjoy hearing about Kimmy's lived experience, her thoughts on mental health, wellness, and social justice. And Kimmy, I thank you in advance for being here today and sharing your thoughts and your story with us. And I'm going to turn everything over to you now. So thank you everybody for being here today, and thank you, Kimmy.
Amy, that was the sweetest introduction I have ever heard in my life. I'm sure I knew at some point that your son was writing his story on my dad, and I'm sure I knew that you lied and said your kids were sick when you pulled them out of school, but I had not remembered that. And so thank you so much for just really brightening up my morning. And I definitely want to shout out Charitable Ventures, and your CEO, Anne, and Dana and Annie, and just for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's such a pleasure. And I want to thank all of you, because I know that there are so many other things you could be doing with your time on a Tuesday morning, and you chose to come out and listen to me share my story. So I'm delighted to be here. So what I'd like to do is, I have a very brief PowerPoint. It's about 7 slides, just to give you a little bit more background around who I am and my story. And then I'm going to come back into the room, and that way we can have more of a personal, intimate conversation. And I'll kind of share with you where I am today, what I'm doing, and then open up the floor for questions, because I always really like to have like real-time conversation with the folks that are in the room. I will tell you right now that I consider myself a safe speaker. So what that means is you are encouraged to ask questions. There's probably not too many questions you could ask that would offend me or surprise me. I always tell people all respectful questions are absolutely open. So please feel free to, engage either in the chat or, if Dana and Amy are comfortable taking yourself off of mute, that's fine too. So give me a second, and I'm going to just pull up this PowerPoint for you. Let's see, we want to start from the beginning. There you are. Okay. Dana, I can see your lovely face. Just give me a thumbs up that you can see the PowerPoint. Yes, thank you. Okay. So often people ask, who is Kimmy Carlos, right? Because I am nothing spectacular in and of itself. What is spectacular is my lived experience, and the fact that I allow myself to be both courageous and vulnerable at the same time in sharing it, because I believe that my journey and my lived experience, when I share it, empowers others and gives others permission to be authentic in their lived experience. So I'm going to just share a little bit about who I am. So I am a trauma and alcoholism survivor. I celebrated 19 years clean and sober this past fall. People often ask me how I, managed to live in recovery. And I always tell them that literally from the day after an anniversary, I start planning for the next anniversary, right? So my brain is already one day at a time until I get to celebrate that 20th anniversary. And my alcoholism was born out of a lot of traumas that I suffered as a child. The greatest trauma of which was the loss of my mother to suicide. And, back then in 1978, people really didn't talk about suicide. We certainly didn't talk about it in the Black African-American community. And we didn't talk about bipolar. And I believe with all my heart that my mother had undiagnosed bipolar, just from what I know about mental illnesses today. And so my father and my mother's siblings and my mother's parents, who were still alive back then, were so grief-stricken and traumatized that they simply did not have the emotional bandwidth or even the vocabulary to talk to, 2 little children, myself and my brother, about why they had suddenly lost their mother in such a violent way. And so that grief and that trauma obviously turned inward, and it came out in active alcoholism for more than 20 years. I did go into recovery in 2001, and that was such a huge blessing for me, because there's so many people that never get the opportunity to go into recovery. I'm a published author of the book, The Window of Grace, Living in Recovery Through Christian Faith. So it talks about my journey through active alcoholism and recovery, and how my faith as a Christian really helped to bring me into recovery and begin to develop those life skills. And it was in that, doing that work, that I became an advocate for mental and emotional wellness, and I became a motivational speaker. So I do a lot of speaking across the country around my journey and what mental and emotional wellness looks like. I am a master facilitator, which means that I design and facilitate a lot of workshops around mental health and wellness. I am a certified wellness and empowerment coach through the Institute of Integrative Nutrition. I am obviously a mental and emotional wellness advocate. I'm a nonprofit founder. I am a certified anti-racism trainer through the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey. And in addition to being a mother and a grandmother of 6, I am most proud of being the daughter of 1968 Olympian, Dr. John Carlos. Most people know my dad as being an Olympian. He is, at one time, was the fastest man in the world. This is a picture of him during the Olympics in Mexico City in 1968. But most people are most familiar with this picture. This was the demonstration in Mexico City in 1968 at the Summer Olympics. And that's my dad on the right, Dr. John Carlos. That's my uncle, Dr. Tommy Smith, in the middle. And my other uncle, Peter Norman, on the left. Most people often ask, who's the white guy in the picture? Peter Norman was a silver medalist in the 440 relay. Peter Norman was Australian. He was not American. Peter is passed now. What most people don't know is that, this was often called the Black Power Salute, the Black Protest. But in the Carlos family, we call it the demonstration, because my father and Tommy and Peter were demonstrating on behalf of the most marginalized people in the world. Those who are poor, those who are oppressed, usually those who are service workers, or what we call today essential workers, right? My dad specifically was demonstrating on behalf of all of the Black and brown service workers in Harlem, New York, where he was born and raised, understanding that they were often living in poverty or sub-poverty wages, recognizing the very essential work that they do, and how often the generationally impoverished remain oppressed and scandalized and marginalized. The only reason Peter Norman didn't have his hand in the air was because they didn't have a glove for him at the time. But there were so many other symbols of the demonstration. So the beads around my father's neck represents all of Black humanity that has been lynched through the years. And all 3 of them had on black socks. And you'll notice that my dad and Tommy took their shoes off during the demonstration. And a whole host of other symbols that they were wearing and carrying to demonstrate on behalf of those who are marginalized and oppressed. And so my dad has done this work for more than 50 years now. This is one of my all-time favorite photos, holding the hand of greatness. In 2019, my siblings and I, between my dad and my stepmom, there's 6 children, and we've given them a whole host of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But my siblings and I got together in 2019, and we threw a 50th anniversary gala to celebrate 50 years of social justice work that my father has done. So in addition to being an Olympian, he has gone on to be a motivational speaker. He is the author of 2 published books, and he has been traveling around the world. In addition to being a high school administrator, he has been traveling for the last 50 years around the world, speaking about equality and equity and social justice, and his deep passion for youth athletics and academics. And so just being on the stage and having the opportunity to hold my dad's hand while we honor him was phenomenal. He was literally over the moon. And this was just one of the greatest moments of my life. But I did come into my own, right? So it's fascinating because, I'm 5'11", my dad is 6'2". I was 5'11" in the 9th grade. And my dad just thought for sure that he had another family athlete on his hands, right? When he saw how tall and slender I was. And sadly, he was disappointed because I tried every sport: tennis, track, swimming, soccer, baseball, softball, gymnastics, and I failed at all of them. At one point, my dad said, just don't even tell people that you're my daughter because you're embarrassing me with this athletics thing, right? But I was blessed and fortunate because what I found is, the gift that I received from my father was the gift of presentation and facilitation and being able to advocate with my voice, right? As I said, my story is what empowers others. And so that's when I began to do the work. When I was released from recovery, people said, don't drink anymore, don't do any drugs, don't smoke anymore, don't go anywhere where they're doing it, don't be around anybody who's doing it. And I remember being stunned and thinking, well, the alcohol was my coping skill, has been my coping skill for more than 20 years. And if you're telling me I can't drink anymore, then I'm going to have to get my arms around this post-traumatic stress disorder and clinical depression and anxiety disorder that you're telling me I have. And so I literally threw myself into every organization that would have me: the National Alliance of Mental Illness, Children's Futures, the Center for Social Justice and Families, Foundations Academy, and Greater Trenton Behavioral Oaks, and any other organization that would have me as a volunteer and a board member, because I was really trying to wrap my brain around what mental health and wellness was. Because again, we didn't really talk about this growing up as a child, and we definitely didn't talk about it in Black America for a whole host of social, cultural, and historical reasons. And as I began to do the work, I began to share my story. And what I learned pretty quickly was that our most marginalized and our most oppressed are our Black and Brown communities in urban areas. And when I say urban, I mean our densely populated cities and towns that are largely populated with Black and Brown families and communities and immigrants, and usually living in generational poverty. And I realized that that was a very unique population because of a lot of the adversities and the social injustices that those communities have endured for centuries. And so it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought, being a mental health advocate, simply skipping into, our urban communities and sharing my story and giving information around how to advocate for mental health. And as God would have it, I moved into Trenton, New Jersey, little town in Mercer County, for those of you who don't know. And, Trenton is like any other urbanized community. There's a lot of poverty, but there's also a lot of resilience and creativity and love and passion. And I lived in Trenton. I worshiped in church at Trenton. And for some years, I actually worked in Trenton as well. And that's where I believe the creator, for those of you who believe in a higher power, the creator gave me the vision for the Urban Mental Health Alliance. And it was an opportunity to create a nonprofit that spoke specifically to mental health in urban communities. And the philosophy was that we need to meet people where they are. We can't serve people by A, assuming that we know what they need, and B, assuming that if we build it, they'll come. We need to go deep into those urban communities where others will not go. We need to serve those that are most vulnerable and most marginalized, those who are so deep in poverty and homelessness and substance use disorder and abuse that they suddenly become invisible to the rest of the world. Because I have a deep-seated philosophy that when we empower people and uplift people with knowledge and resources, then they know how to save themselves, right? So me and about 7 really passionate colleagues came together. We built the Urban Mental Health Alliance as a nonprofit. We were operational for 7 years. And I remember vividly, Amy, after you chased me around like I was Mickey Mouse, we had the opportunity to go and have dinner. I don't know if you remember. And I remember sitting across the table from you, and I mentioned the Urban Mental Health Alliance, and I don't even think I had a name for it yet, but I was just kind of sharing with you the concept of what I was thinking. And I'll never forget, you looked at me and you said, if you make this happen, I'll do everything I can to support you. And fast forward some years later, we ended up working in the same building together. And I was in Amy's office a lot, while I was building this nonprofit. And we went on to be extremely successful. We ran several annual conferences and panels and roundtables, and we did over 500 workshops across Mercer County. We specifically spoke to depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, how to advocate for yourself and your family member when there's mental illness, and really teaching those in our urban communities what mental health and wellness is, as well as how to recognize a mental health crisis. I got a rude awakening in doing this work because I realized that mental health in Black and Brown communities is indeed a social justice issue. And that brings me to today, after having done the work in Trenton and across Mercer County on mental health. I felt a greater calling to really begin to talk about the intersection between mental health, social justice, and systemic racism, and how that has still affects our country today. And so I do a lot of training around amplifying and advancing wellness to affect social change. And I believe it took me 55 years to land here and realize that everything I went through as a person, my journey through the trauma, through the active alcoholism, through the very intense fight to get into recovery and stay into recovery, and all the work that I did, as an advocate, and all the adversaries that didn't want to see me do that, was to bring me here to be able to really talk about what wellness looks like in our most marginalized communities, and what do we do moving forward. So with that, I want to come into the room and share a little bit more about what that journey looks like today. So as I said, I founded the Urban Mental Health Alliance, did that work we were in existence for 7 years, but we had been doing the work as a board for about 2 years before we formally launched as a 501c3. So almost a decade, we did that work. And then when we decided that we were going to step away from the organization, I decided that I wanted to launch the consulting firm, because I had so many people reaching out to me wanting to talk about what trauma looked like in our Black and Brown communities, what trauma looked like for those that are in substance use disorder. Couple that with the fact that a few years ago, the head priest in my church, I'm Episcopalian, and the head priest in our cathedral, who is a dean, came to me and said he wanted me to take anti-racism training. And I remember being quite offended. In my naivete, I thought, as a Black woman, like, what could I possibly learn in anti-racism training, right? And he said, I really, really want you to take this class. Well, in the Episcopal Church, if the head dean says he wants you to do something, you go and do it. So I was a little annoyed that I had to give up my weekend, right? And so, I was sitting in the class on Friday night, like, I'll just be transparent, I was downright angry that I had to be there. And I'm looking around the room, which was actually quite diverse. Black folks, white folks, people of color. This was maybe about 40 people in the room. And I remember sitting there and being really annoyed that I had to give up my weekend to take this training. I still get emotional. I remember by Sunday afternoon, walking out of that training, feeling so liberated and empowered and humbled all at the same time. I was shocked to realize that I never really understood what infrastructural racism was. I was shocked to understand that calling someone the N-word or a whole host of other ethnic slurs is the lowest form of racism. And I was deeply humiliated to learn the privilege that I and everyone else in this country has based on the backs of our indigenous First Nation people, or what we like to call American Indians, right? I was oblivious to the fact that everything that I have, my education, my home, my job, my healthcare, the fact that I get to drive on paved roads with streetlights, and that we have healthy water, and that we have heat in the winter and air in the summer, and the fact that I have a college degree, and the fact that I was able to get married and have children, and all of these privileges that I had that were built on the backs of our indigenous people that I had never been aware of or even considered. That training changed me. It deeply changed me as a person. And I began to recognize not only my own internalized oppression, but I began to recognize my own personal privilege, and the fact that I had a calling, the fact that I had a responsibility to help create a better world for the children and the grandchildren that I have been blessed with in this life. And if I look at everything that I did in active alcoholism, there is no reason to explain why I have been blessed with all the grace that the Creator has given me, except that He has a purpose for me. So after doing that training, that's when I became passionate about mental health as a social justice issue, and really beginning to reckon between what racism looks like and how that affects the wellness of everyone, right? And we know now that the horse is out of the barn. We can no longer pretend after the last 4 years that systemic racism doesn't exist, because we've seen it quite clearly, right? We've seen what racist behavior looks like. We've seen what white supremacist behavior looks like, and we've seen the brutality and the violence that comes out of that. We've seen it on television. We've seen it in social media. We've seen it in what we read, right? The trauma that the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor brought upon the country as a whole, but especially upon Black African Americans, is not new. But it was even heightened that much more because we got to see it in real time. And we got to see how we as a country have either responded or not responded to it, right? So we're living in an incredible time in history right now, because for the first time ever, we're having honest, transparent, authentic conversation about what systemic racism is, right? Not racist behaviors, but what systemic infrastructural racism is, and how every part of our country has been built on the concept of superior and inferior, and on the oppression of one population and the empowerment of another. You know, I have great reverence for our young youth poet laureate, Amanda Gorman. Her inaugural poem was and is powerful. It was powerful to hear her recite it. It was even more powerful to read it. But I think the most powerful line is when she said, "We are not a broken country. We are an unfinished country." That means we all have work to do, right? So in doing the work, in understanding systemic racism and looking at, you know, my Black children and my Black and Puerto Rican grandchildren, you know, and realizing that the country is yet unfinished, and having done the advocacy work around mental health and wellness in Black and Brown communities, when I founded Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consulting, it was based on beginning to understand and recognize what equity and justice is. And realizing that it's so much bigger than mental health and wellness. It's so much bigger than my journey through alcoholism. It's really about how we as a country have oppressed the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, and how we are all responsible for doing the work. So what I'm going to give you today is my deepest philosophy and belief. I believe that because systemic racism is so deeply embedded in the fabric of our country, there is no lane that you could be in where you won't have the opportunity to do the work. So what does that mean? My thing is mental health and wellness. I'm passionate about it. I eat, sleep, and breathe it. Everybody who knows me, in fact, in Trenton, they call me the mental health lady, right? If you give me 10 minutes of your time, you're going to get 10 minutes of wisdom around mental health and wellness, right? That is my lane. And my gift is being able to speak, even with the social anxiety that I live with, because I'm so passionate about this and because I've been doing it for so long, this is what comes natural for me, right? So that is my lane. So in the lane of mental health and wellness, that's where I do the social justice work. That's where I work to dismantle the infrastructures and the systems that create barriers of oppression based on systemic racism. Because I believe that the way forward is equity and justice, right? Equity is indeed justice, and justice is indeed prevention. So when we begin to dismantle those systems and infrastructures that oppress, that marginalize, that divide, that breed violence and brutality, when we begin to dismantle those, that is the creation of equity. That is giving those what they need. So what I need and what Amy needs might be two different things. Equality is me getting what Amy got. Equity is me getting what I need and Amy getting what she needs. That's equity. And justice is prevention. If we can create systemic racism, if we can create systemic inequality, we can also create systemic justice. And as Ralph Nader told me once, when I had the opportunity to meet him, he said, justice is prevention. When you create just systems, you prevent the need for charity. Now, charity is not a bad thing because we need administration, and there are always going to be those who are marginalized that we need to support with charity. But there's so much charity work that's unnecessary. And if we create just systems that eliminate the barriers that oppress and marginalize and brutalize whole populations and generations of people, then it eliminates the need for that charitable work, right? So I believe deeply that it's our responsibility, every living, breathing person, regardless of what your race, ethnicity, or nationality is, you're responsible for helping to create a better world. For my people of color in the room, my Black, African American, Latino, or any other person of color, I believe your number one responsibility is your healing and wellness, because if you are a person of color, you have lived with and experienced and engaged with trauma on some level. If you are not a person of color, if you are one of my white brothers and sisters, I encourage you to get educated around what wellness is, what education around what anti-racism is, and education around equity and justice, so that you can begin to understand what the lived experience is for those who don't walk with the level of privilege that you have. Because while I have an incredible level of privilege, I will never have the level of privilege to be white. And as long as I and the people who look like me don't have that, we will never live in an equitable and just country. I believe this so deeply that equity is justice and justice is prevention, that I am actually in the midst of writing my next book, and I have created an entire workshop around race, racism, and the way forward. And so I encourage you to think about what you have the bandwidth for, because some of us are going to look at me and say, I want to do what she's doing. I want to run around and talk about it. And some of you are going, there's no way in hell I'm standing up there and talking about it. But you know what? I've got access to funds. How can I support organizations that are doing the grassroots work, right? And some of you are going to say, the only bandwidth I have right now is to learn everything I can so I can be a better person when I engage with the world. Whatever your level of bandwidth is, that's okay. Do the work. Even if it's just to learn how to be a better person, the way you engage with the world, you're modeling that for the next person. So you are doing the work. You don't have to be a depressed drunk like I was to recognize the privilege that you have. But I think we all have a responsibility to make change. And I am so grateful. I'm grateful for a father who showed me what courage is, who showed me what passion is, who, when I went to him and said, I want to start telling my story about my journey through alcoholism, he said, I'm not going to stand in the way of what you were called to do. I'm grateful that I have children who have forgiven me for being a lousy parent, for drinking through most of their childhood. I'm grateful that they love me and still want me to be a part of their lives. I'm grateful for the 6 beautiful grandchildren that they give me that I get to see every day, who are literally the joy of my life. And I'm grateful for organizations like Charitable Ventures and Amy, who want to bring my very progressive, edgy voice to the table to have the difficult conversations. Because I believe if we don't have the difficult conversations, we can't make change. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is in this country is everybody wants to get to racial reckoning, but nobody wants to address the trauma, the generational trauma. And in any relationship, personal, professional, national, you have to first deal with the pain before you can get to the reconciliation. And so I'm the one who has the hard conversation around the pain and making that change. And I'm so grateful that you've given me the opportunity to do that with you today. And so I want to pass it back to Amy for the next 15 minutes. And I am delighted to take any questions or feedback that you have.
Kimmy, thank you so much. I think you've just shown everybody exactly why I love you and why we've stayed connected. Thank you for sharing your story. And I know people are going to have some questions. I'm seeing some in the chat room. I'm going to turn it to Dana, though, to let Dana moderate the chat room questions, probably starting with our own Ann Owens question, Dana. So
Yeah.
Thank you, Kimmy.
Well, and Anne's still here. Anne, do you want me to take the question or did you want to? Okay. So she's saying that our nonprofit industry is full of best practices, theories of change, and policy efforts as they work for change, which can all be pretty wonky. So can you talk to us a little bit about the role of lived experience or not having lived experience in meeting people where they are?
Yes, excellent question. Before I do, because I forgot to do this in the intro, I want to give a shout out to my old friend, Ed, who is in the room. Thank you so much for joining me. Ed and I went to grad school together. I haven't seen Ed in years. So when I saw your face pop up, I was just so tickled. So thank you so much for joining me, my friend. So that's an excellent question. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for lived experience, right? So when I first started doing this work, I felt that old imposter syndrome, right? Because I'm not a clinician, I'm not a social worker. In fact, I got my degree in theology with a minor in psychology. And so here I am trying to talk about mental health and wellness, right? And simply because I'm passionate, and most of us who are in the nonprofit work, we're doing it because we're passionate, right? We're not doing it because we're going to get rich. We're not doing it because we're going to be, prominent from it, right? We're doing it because we believe in the mission, or we believe in the service, and we're passionate, and that's what typically drives us, right? And so that's where I was coming from in doing the work. But I had a colleague sit me down one time, and she said, you're selling yourself short. She said, it doesn't matter that you don't have a master's degree, in social work or as a clinician. And it doesn't matter that you don't have a prominent title. She said, you have lived experience that no one talks about, right? And that lived experience gives you more street cred and authority than any title could possibly give you. Because if you don't walk in that journey, then you can only speak from theory or philosophy. Not that that's a bad thing, right? But the lived experience gives you a sense of empathy and compassion to understand those who have walked that journey with you, right? And it gives you a different perspective. So when I talk about racism, I talk about the lived experience of racism. When I talk about substance use disorder, I talk about the lived experience of substance use disorder, because what my degree in theology taught me is that the world's religions, the world's faiths, the oldest religions and faiths all talk about the same thing. And that is a basic respect of humanity. So I don't even have to like you to respect your humanity. I don't have to agree with you to respect your humanity, right? And so when I have that lived experience, then I can speak to your humanity and I can bring my humanity to respect yours to affect change. So when I teach about anti-racism, I teach about what anti-racism looks like in the lives of Black and Brown folks, the trauma and the violence and the brutality that Black and Brown folks have experienced, the resilience that Black and Brown folks have to survive generations of oppression and marginalization, right? When I talk about substance use disorder, I teach about the lived experience of the trauma that it's usually born out of, the guilt and the humiliation and the judgment that you feel when you're stuck in this disease and there's so little resources to support you. And what does it mean to get into recovery and stay into recovery? Because I could get on the screen and throw a whole bunch of statistics at you, but I believe what statistics and theory does is it dehumanizes the people that these experiences represent. So I'm not interested in telling you how many Black folks or how many brown folks or how many children or how many, people in recovery. I'm interested in explaining what that looks like in people's lives. And I believe that needs to go hand in hand with practices and policies and higher education and degrees and licenses. All of that is important. We need that infrastructure. We need that higher knowledge, but we need to be working alongside with people who have that lived experience to talk about what it means to walk around in a body that's literally addictive. What it means to engage with a world that views the color of your skin as a weapon. We have to have that lived experience to remember that we are engaging with humanity at all times.
Thank you. So there are a number of lovely messages to you, Kimmy, in the chat, thanking you for this conversation today. We'll make sure everyone that she sees those messages, keep them coming. I do want to skip down to the next question, though, which comes actually from our own Susan Johnson. Can you talk to us a little bit about what equity looks like for POC, people of color, in the nonprofit world? Specific examples would be helpful here.
Yes, that's a great question. So there are whole organizations that work to support people of color that are doing the nonprofit work. I think that there's three things in general that we need to do, but especially in nonprofit work and in our education sectors. There's three things that we need to do that I think is really important. One is the obvious. We all need to have anti-racism training. That's whether you're white or a person of color, so that you understand the way you've been socialized, whether that's internalized superiority or internalized inferiority, to recognize what systemic racism looks like, how to begin to dismantle that, right? So that's number one. That's whether you go through formal training with a certification like I did, or you do the homework with a lot of resource materials, right? And if you're interested, Ann and Amy, I can send you a whole list of resources to share. So that's number one, right? So if you are a person of color, Black, African-American, Latino, or any other person of color, Asian American, Pacific Islander, East Asian, South Asian, you still need to do the work around anti-racism, right? So that you can recognize how you engage with the world and how the world engages with you as a nonprofit professional. Because the truth is, no matter how many accolades or credentials or degrees you have, when you walk in a room, you're still viewed as a person of color before anything else. So you need to understand how to engage with the world living in that body. The second thing that I think is really important is that people of color, especially Black folks and Latino folks, have to really learn how to engage the world with self-advocacy. And I want to make sure that I'm clear about this. We have been taught, we've been socialized to be of service. We've taught to keep everybody in the room comfortable. Because if we don't do that, when Black folks and brown folks make people uncomfortable, they can often be killed or jailed or otherwise harmed. So we've learned directly and indirectly to keep our mouths shut, to keep everybody comfortable, to keep everything status quo. And we have not had a lot of people model for us what self-advocacy looks like. So we have to learn how to bring our voices to the table unabashedly and unapologetically. We have to recognize that we deserve to be in the room and that we bring valid authority and knowledge to the table in the room. And the third thing is our folks who are not of color need to learn how to be an ally. And that's difficult for us in this country because, again, we've been so socialized to understand superiority and inferiority that we view life as pie, right? If you get more pie, I get less. And that's not what equity is. The Creator created a world where we have enough for every single human being who has ever been born and who will ever be born, right? But because we as people always assume that, you know, if I give you some of mine, then I'll have less, right? As an ally, you understand equity, and therefore you are comfortable being vulnerable enough to say, I'm going to step back and let those marginalized voices in the room be heard. I'm going to bring my voice to the table when I see injustice. I'm going to use my privilege to dismantle infrastructures that are oppressing people. Because what's really, really important is that when one of us rises, we all rise. It's not pie. If you help me to rise, you're not going to get less. In fact, we're all going to get more, right? So there needs to be anti-racism training. Our people of color need to understand self-advocacy, and our white brothers and sisters need to understand what it means to be an ally.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And this next question, I think, actually builds off of what you're saying a little bit. So you've spoken really eloquently about how to be an ally for people of color when you're not a person of color. But Mario Ortega asks, it is important for people of color to work together for social justice and equity. So how do we bridge the gap of having different communities work together and support each other while acknowledging that their experiences may have been different?
Right, such a great question, right? So there is, I don't even know how to say this. I want to be transparent about this. There's a strategy, philosophy, school of thought, right? That if the powers that be, which is largely rich white men, can deflect and distract us so that we fight amongst ourselves, then they get to keep all the cookies. Does that make sense? So Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he understood that. And he knew that if you bring all of the oppressed, right? Because many of us who are oppressed who might not necessarily be dealing with racism, but are still oppressed, right? So there's plenty of white folks who are poor. There's plenty of white folks who are marginalized. There's plenty of white folks who are discriminated against. It's just not because of the color of their skin. And so Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King understood that. And he understood that if you can bring all of those who are oppressed and all of those who are marginalized together, that there's strength in numbers. And in a nonviolent way, Well, there were powers that be that weren't happy when he figured that one out. And so there's great respect for Reverend Barber, who is now following in his steps with the Poor People's Campaign, which Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King initially founded, right? To bring the country's poor and impoverished and oppressed together so that there's one voice, right? But it's going to take a lot of work. And I know I sound like a broken record. It's going to take a lot of work going back to, again, understanding what racism is. The reality of systemic racism is so brutal and is so violent and insidious that most people can't wrap their brains around it, right? It's so entrenched in everything that we do. And systemic racism has done an excellent job of dividing people. So Black African Americans not only experience prejudice and discrimination against white folks often and white institutions, but we also experience it from other people of color. Because in this country, we teach that Black African Americans are the lowest form of humanity. We teach that directly and indirectly. And as long as we teach our children to view ethnicities in terms of levels and who is human and who's not human and who's valued and who's not valued and who's worthy and who's not worthy, we will always be divided as people, regardless of what your skin color or what your ethnicity is. So it goes back to doing the work. And for me, doing the work means anti-racism work and spirituality work, because it's the spirituality work that keeps me from being angry at white folks and keeps me focused on the dragon in the room, which is the infrastructure, right? And when I work on dismantling the most oppressive infrastructures, then I know that we all rise together. So I'm not going to see the ideal world that I want. I'm not going to live long. If I live for another 100 years, I probably won't see it. But I'm going to die knowing that the work that I've done has benefited everybody that came in contact with me. And that's regardless of what your skin color is, what your nationality is, what your faith is, what your gender is, what your sexuality is. None of that matters. What matters to me is creating a better world, and I'm going to die knowing that my kids and grandkids are going to see that because I worked for it. And I believe that that's how we bring cohesiveness together, is when we learn to do the work.
Wow. Kimmy, you're inspirational and amazing, and we'll share, like, the chat room is lighting up with praise for you. So thank you for being here today. I know that in the past, you've been super open about sharing your contact information, which I suspect I'm going to get many emails after this asking me for how do I reach Kimmy. So with your permission, I'm happy to share that out.
Yes, please feel free to share my email, Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consult. Please feel free to visit my website. It's very easy, KimmyCarlos.com. I do try really hard to respond to anybody and everybody who reaches out to me. So don't, hesitate to do that, even if you just want to have more conversation, if you're interested in resources, if you want me to come and speak. I really try to, engage as much as I can. Amy and I were chuckling on the phone yesterday, and I told her my yardstick is I will have arrived when I can hire a personal assistant, but I don't have a personal assistant yet. So feel free to reach out to me and you will actually get me.
All right, well, we will do that. Charitable Ventures will share out the resources, perhaps in our next newsletter with all of you. So please come back, visit Charitable Ventures, visit Kimmy's website. We're here for you. And Kimmy, thank you so much again for just starting us off right this morning and re-engaging us and just sharing, being with us. So thank you everybody for attending this morning. Thank you, Charitable Ventures team, much appreciated.
Have a wonderful spring.
Thank you. Everyone's clapping for you, Kimmy, in the virtual room here. Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
everyone.